The smell of bleach never leaves the skin. It gets into the creases of the knuckles, under the nails, into the part of a woman's hair if she leans over a bucket long enough, and it stays there through the bus ride home, through the shower, through the 6 hours of sleep before the alarm goes off, and does it all again. That was the smell of Ward 4 at 2:47 in the morning. The night a man worth $400 million stopped breathing, and the only person close enough to notice was the one nobody in the building had bothered to learn the name of. The monitor screamed. 12 people froze. One woman did not. She had 11 seconds before his brain started to die, and she used every one of them for something the surveillance footage would later call, in a report nobody outside 3 organizations would ever read, an anomaly. She didn't scream back at the machine. She just moved. Morning arrived 9 hours earlier, with the smell of instant coffee and singed rice, the bottom of the pot kind that Marisol de la Cruz scraped into a plastic container because throwing away food had never once, in 34 years, felt like an option available to her. The apartment was 412 square feet on the 3rd floor of a building on Osborne Street that smelled permanently of somebody else's fried garlic, and the mildew that lived behind the bathroom tile, no matter how much bleach she poured on it. She poured a lot of bleach on it. Bleach was the one thing in her life that was cheap and did exactly what it promised. She counted the bills on the kitchen table twice, because the number didn't get better the second time, but some old superstition in her made her check anyway. $640. Rent was $1,190, due in 5 days. Her son Iggy's inhaler copay was $38, and he'd used the last puff of the old one on Tuesday, holding it up to show her it was empty, not crying, just informing her, the way an 8-year-old learns to report facts instead of ask for things when he's watched his mother's face do the math too many times. She wasn't hungry. She was tired in a way that had stopped being about sleep 2 years ago. She left for the hospital at 9:40 p.m., wearing scrubs the color of dishwater that had once been teal, a state-issued badge that read housekeeping, and, beneath that, De La Cruz, M, and shoes with a hole starting in the left sole that she'd lined with a folded grocery bag. In Manila, before the visa, before the recruiter who took 11,000 pesos and vanished, before the credentialing board that told her 7 years as a critical care nurse in Quezon City did not meet equivalency requirements, without explaining what would, she had once run a code team. Here, in this country, on this ward, she pushed a cart. The cart had a squeaking wheel. Nobody had oiled it in the 4 months she'd worked the overnight shift, and nobody would, because fixing squeaking wheels was not anybody's job description, including hers, technically. But she oiled it herself once with a little bottle of WD-40 she bought for $4.99, because the sound made her want to put her head through a wall by hour 6 of a 12-hour shift. It wasn't the job that broke people down, it was the invisibility. Nurses walked past her like she was a fixture, a plant, a floor lamp that occasionally needed to be moved. Doctors said, "Excuse me," to the mop bucket, not to her. A resident once stepped directly over her outstretched arm while she was wiping up a spill rather than walk the extra 4 feet around, murmuring, "Sorry," to the tile. She had stopped, that once, and looked at her own hand on the floor like it belonged to someone else. She was assigned Ward 4 that month, the private wing, the one with a keypad on the door and a separate elevator, the one where the rooms had wood paneling instead of curtains, and a family sometimes posted a very large, very quiet man outside a door in a suit that cost more than her yearly rent. She'd learned not to ask questions on Ward 4. She'd learned that the man in room 411 came in 9 days ago after a fall, that his security detail rotated in 3-hour shifts, that the nurses on this floor got a bonus for discretion, and that a man named Salt, she never learned if that was a name or a nickname or a warning, sat outside that door reading the same folded newspaper every night without turning a page. She smelled him before she ever saw his face. Cedar, black pepper, and the particular sweetness of a cigar, smoked hours ago, and showered off, but never entirely gone. Dante Cusano's signature moved through a room half a minute before he did, the way weather moves ahead of a front. At 11:42 that night, 18 minutes before his heart tried to quit on him, Dante Cusano was already awake, sitting up in a hospital bed with an IV taped to the back of his hand, like an insult he was tolerating, reviewing numbers on a legal pad his lawyer had smuggled in against every order the hospital had given. 11.4 million was gone. Not lost, moved. Somebody inside the Cusano organization had rerouted a shipment meant for the Baltimore docks into a warehouse that didn't exist on paper, and by morning, in 6 hours and 18 minutes, 3 separate crews expecting product would either get paid or get told there was no product, and in Dante's world, no product and no explanation were the same sentence as, someone dies for this. 6 hours, he said, to no one, to the room, to the cedar smell of his own jacket hanging on the door hook. 6 hours to find out who. Outside his door, Salt didn't turn a page. The man 2 floors down handling the audit, the one man Dante trusted with a ledger, hadn't answered his phone in 40 minutes. Dante's lawyer, a compact man named Reyes, who wore his fear like a tight collar, kept his eyes on the legal pad rather than on Dante's face, because eye contact currently felt like a decision with consequences. You should be resting, Reyes said. I should be a lot of things, Dante said, and didn't raise his voice, and Reyes flinched anyway, the way men who worked for Dante Cusano had learned to flinch at quiet more than shouting, because the quiet was where the decisions got made. Nobody in that room noticed the woman with the cart pass the door twice. Nobody noticed anything about her at all. That was, up until 2:47 a.m., the entire point of her. By midnight, the ward had gone the particular quiet of a hospital at its lowest ebb, the hum of machines louder than any voice, the smell of latex and old coffee, and, underneath it, the bleach Marisol had just used on 409. She restocked her cart. Paper towels, 62 left in the case. 2 bottles of surface cleaner, 3/4 full. She did this math without thinking about it, the same reflexive counting she did with dollars, because a woman who has been made to feel disposable learns to keep meticulous track of everything that is not. She thought about Iggy's inhaler. She thought about the $38. She did not think, even once, about the man in 411, because men in 411 were not people who thought about her either. At 2:41 a.m., Dante Cusano's monitor showed a rhythm that meant nothing good, a jagged confusion where a heartbeat should be, and by 2:44, it had gone from bad to a flat, screaming line that filled the hallway with a sound like an alarm clock nobody could find. 2 nurses ran in. A third called it. Salt was on his feet, with a gun half drawn before his own brain caught up to the fact that there was nothing in that room to shoot. Marisol was 11 feet away, wiping down a supply cart, and she heard the tone change before anyone said the word code. She had heard that tone 400 times in Quezon City. Her body reacted before her mind gave it permission. The cart abandoned mid-roll, the squeaking wheel spinning to a stop behind her. 12 years of instinct arriving 9 seconds before the crash cart did. The room went very still around the noise, which is its own kind of silence. Everyone moving, no one speaking, the 2 nurses staring at a flatline and a bag valve mask, like objects in a language they'd only half learned in school, because Ward 4's nurses were chosen for discretion and comfort and quiet competence, not for codes, not for this. She stepped past a nurse who did not stop her, because at that moment the nurse had nothing left to stop her with. Her hands went to his sternum. 2 inches, 110 compressions a minute, counted not in numbers but in the rhythm of a song she didn't consciously choose, the way her hands had been trained to choose it for her a decade and a country ago. Get the crash cart open. Charge to 200, she said, and her voice did not shake, and it was the first order anyone in that room had heard her give in 4 months of being furniture. Salt's gun was still in his hand, forgotten, pointed at the floor. Somebody said her name, read it off her badge, Dela Cruz M, like it was information instead of a woman, and nobody corrected them because there was no time for names, only for 15 more compressions and a shock and the specific white noise of a defibrillator charging in a room where 12 people had gone absolutely, perfectly silent. The line on the monitor jumped. Once, then again, ragged, then thin, wavering, but there, a rhythm. Nobody moved for 4 full seconds. It wasn't relief, it was disbelief wearing relief's clothes. Dante Cusano's eyes opened 40 seconds later to a hospital ceiling, a doctor's voice he didn't recognize, and, standing over him with bleach on her hands and her badge crooked from where someone had grabbed her sleeve, a housekeeping aide he had walked past 100 times without once looking at her face. He didn't say anything. For the first time since he was 19 years old and had watched his own father die without flinching, Dante Cusano had absolutely nothing to say. The silence in that room lasted 11 seconds. It felt, to everyone in it, like 11 years. "You're welcome," Marisol said, to the ceiling more than to him, and went to go find her cart. By the time the day shift arrived, the story had already changed shape 4 times, the way stories do, in buildings full of people trained not to talk. The chart said cardiac event, resolved. The nurses who'd stood frozen said nothing to anyone, because their jobs depended on saying nothing, and Marisol said nothing because nobody asked her, not really, not in the way that expected an answer. She finished her shift at 7 a.m. exactly. She clocked out. She rode the 6 bus home smelling of bleach and adrenaline, and somewhere around 4th and Cole the shaking finally caught up with her hands, 4 hours late, the way it always did, her body cashing the check her nerves had written and postponed. Iggy was eating cereal with too much milk in it, dry from the $2 left in the box, watching a cartoon with the sound down low so as not to wake her when she came in. "You did a code?" he asked, because he could read it on her the way children read weather on their mothers' faces. "I did my job," she said, and kissed the top of his head, and didn't tell him whose chest her hands had been on, because there are things you do not bring into a 400-square-foot apartment that already has enough weight pressing on its walls. She slept 4 hours. She woke to a knock on the door that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up with a reason to be afraid. The landlord, she thought first, then Iggy's school, then, absurdly, immigration. The fear that never fully leaves a woman whose status once depended on a recruiter who'd taken her money and disappeared. It was none of those things. It was a man in a suit that did not belong on Osborne Street, holding an envelope, standing very still, the way men stand when they have been trained to look unthreatening and have never once succeeded. "Mrs. Dela Cruz," he said, "Mr. Cusano would like to see you." "It's Ms.," she said, and did not open the door any wider than the chain allowed. Dante Cusano did not go to people. People went to Dante Cusano, and everyone in 3 states understood that as a law of physics more reliable than gravity, which was why what happened at 3 p.m. that afternoon, in a hospital room with the blinds drawn and a folded newspaper untouched on the chair outside, unsettled the 2 nurses who witnessed it more than the flatline had. He had asked to see her again, alone, and when Reyes, his lawyer, suggested this was unwise given optics and liability, and several other words that meant nothing to a man who had just spent 11 seconds not breathing, Dante had said only, "Get her," in the same quiet voice he used for everything, the voice that had never once needed to be louder, because everyone around him had learned, a long time ago, exactly what quiet from him could cost. Marisol came on her shift that night, still smelling faintly of the industrial soap she used at home, the kind that came in a bar because bars were 40 cents cheaper than bottles. She wheeled her cart past room 411, out of habit, and found Salt standing in the doorway instead of the hall. "He wants to talk to you," Salt said. "I have a floor to clean," he said now. She thought briefly about walking away. She thought about the 11,000 pesos the recruiter had taken, and the 7 years of nursing that this country said did not exist, about every time a doctor had stepped over her arm without seeing it as an arm, and something in her, old, stubborn, the same thing that had made her hands move before her mind gave permission the night before, decided that a dangerous man's patience was not, in fact, more important than her own. "Tell him I'll be in when I finish 409, she said, and pushed her cart past him, and did not look back to see his face. She did finish 409. She took 11 extra minutes doing it, on purpose, and then she went to room 411, and Dante Cusano, sitting up in bed with color back in his face, and an IV he'd clearly threatened someone into removing early, looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle piece that does not belong to the puzzle he thought he was solving. "You made me wait," he said. Not angry, almost amused. In the flat way a man is amused when something surprising has not yet decided whether to also be dangerous. "You weren't dying anymore. I checked your monitor from the hall." Silence. A short one. The kind that told her he was recalculating something. "I want to give you a job," he said. "I have a job. A better one. Better pay. Better hours. You'd work for me directly." "Doing what?" "Whatever needed doing. What you did last night, for one." She looked at him for a long moment, at the cedar and cigar smell of him that even a hospital couldn't launder out, at the very expensive stitching on the robe someone had brought him from home, and she felt the old tiredness in her spine, the one that had nothing to do with sleep. "I have a license," she said. "Or I did, before this country decided 7 years of critical care doesn't count for anything unless I redo 4 of them and pay for the privilege. I'm not doing whatever needed doing for a man whose paper doesn't say what his money says. I have a son. I need my name on something that keeps me safe, not something that gets me a folder in somebody's filing cabinet. You'd be paid in cash, untraceable, more than you make in a year, in a month. Untraceable is a word people use right before they tell you it's also unprotected," she said. "I've been broke. I've never been stupid. Those aren't the same disease." He didn't argue. That, more than anything, told her something about him, that he did not waste breath convincing people who had already made up their minds, because breath, like everything else in his world, was a resource he tracked. "Think about it," he said. "I did. That was my thinking. Get better, Mr. Cusano." And she wheeled her cart out, and the squeaking wheel was the loudest sound in the hallway, and for the second time in 2 days, Dante Cusano sat in a room with absolutely nothing to say. She went home that morning and told herself it was over. A strange story, a strange 48 hours, something she'd tell no one, ever, because telling it meant explaining a version of herself she'd buried under bleach and rent, and a language of small, exact numbers. She went back to her floor the next week. She oiled her cartwheel again with the same $4.99 can. She scraped rice into the same container. Iggy's inhaler ran out on a Thursday. She had $31 left after rent that month, and $38 was the copay, and the difference between those two numbers, $7, sat on her kitchen table like an accusation. She called the pharmacy and asked, again, about the generic, and was told, again, that this was the generic. She stood in her kitchen at 11 p.m., holding an empty inhaler up to the light like it might refill itself out of shame, and she thought, despite every instinct that told her not to, about a man who tracked cash like a language and who paid, according to rumor she'd overheard in the break room without meaning to, more in an afternoon than she made in a season. The knock came again 2 days later. Same man, same suit, same envelope. Except this time there was no job offer inside it. Just a business card with a phone number and, paper clipped to it, without explanation, without a note, a receipt from the pharmacy on 4th showing a $38 charge, paid in full. She held that receipt for a long time before she understood what it meant. It didn't mean he was kind. She was fairly certain kindness was not a language Dante Cusano spoke fluently. It meant he had found out, somehow, through whatever quiet machinery men like him kept running in the background of other people's lives, exactly what she needed, and had paid for it without being asked, the way a man puts a stone on a scale he intends to tip later. It was a gift, with a hook buried in the ribbon. She knew it. She took it anyway, because Iggy needed to breathe, and pride, she had learned a long time ago, was a luxury item, priced well above what she could currently afford. She called the number on the card 3 days later, not because she wanted the job, because she wanted, this once, to set the terms herself instead of having them handed to her, folded into an envelope she hadn't asked for. "I'll do this my way," she told him, standing in a leather-upholstered office on the 41st floor that smelled, underneath the cedar, of money that had been laundered so many times it no longer smelled like anything at all. Contract. 6 months. My hours around my son's school schedule. And if I say a thing is too much, it's too much, and you don't ask twice. "Done," he said, before she'd finished the sentence, which told her he'd have agreed to worse. "And nobody in that building calls me the housekeeper again. Not to my face, not behind it." For the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been the ancestor of a smile moved across Dante Cusano's face, gone before it fully arrived. "Ms. Dela Cruz," he said, like he was trying the shape of her name in his mouth for the first time, and finding he preferred it to the one on her old badge. "Welcome to the payroll." She told herself, walking out of that office in shoes she'd finally replaced, that it was a trap dressed up as a lifeline. She was right. She walked into it anyway, eyes open, the way people walk into weather they've already checked the forecast for and decided to brave regardless. The first month on Dante's payroll taught her the shape of his world the way a new nurse learns a hospital, not from anyone explaining it, but from watching where people flinched. She learned that Reyes flinched at phones ringing after 10 p.m. She learned that Salt did not flinch at anything, ever, which she came to understand was its own kind of information. She learned that the $11.4 million had, in fact, been found, traced to a warehouse in a name nobody recognized, which meant someone inside the organization had built a door only they knew existed, and that the search for who had built it was still, quietly, underway, the way a fire keeps burning under floorboards long after the smoke stops showing. Her job, officially, was medical liaison, a title Reyes had invented specifically so it would mean nothing to anyone who asked. Unofficially, she was there for the moments no hospital would touch, a bullet that needed removing without a report filed, a man's blood pressure crashing in the back room of a restaurant that did not officially exist, a child, once, with a fever nobody trusted a public ER to see quietly. She did the work with the same flat competence she'd once brought to a critical care unit in Quezon City, and she took her cash in an envelope on the first of the month, and she paid her rent 9 days early for the first time in 4 years, and she told Iggy she'd gotten a promotion, which was, in its way, not even a lie. 6 weeks in, the bigger test came, the way bigger tests always arrive, without warning, dressed as an ordinary night. It was a summer gala, technically a fundraiser for a children's hospital wing that had Dante Cusano's name quietly attached to a very large donation. The kind of event where 300 people in evening wear ate $7 a bite shrimp off silver trays, and nobody in the room would have admitted, under oath, to knowing what the man funding half the wing actually did between Tuesdays. Marisol was there in a dress Reyes had bought her, navy, plain, expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself, standing near an exit the way she'd learned to stand, because in this world, exits mattered more than centerpieces. At 9:14 p.m., a man near the bar collapsed. Not staged, not a threat, an actual, ordinary cardiac event, the kind 300 well-dressed strangers watch happen and then step back from like it might be contagious. She was moving before she'd finished processing what she'd seen, the way her body had moved in room 411, the way it had been trained to move a decade and a country ago. She had him breathing again in 90 seconds, before the hotel's own medical team had even located the AED, and the room did the same thing Ward 4 had done, went silent, then loud, then silent again, a crowd deciding in real time what it had just witnessed. It was, on its surface, an unrelated event. It was also, she would learn within the hour, the exact kind of chaos someone had been waiting for. Because while 300 guests focused on the man on the floor, a side door near the kitchen, a door with a keypad Dante's own security had installed, opened for 4 seconds longer than any of the catering staff's badges should have allowed, and a flash drive the size of a thumbnail changed hands between a sommelier who had worked the gala circuit for 6 years without incident, and a guest whose name, when Salt ran it later that night, connected to nothing at all, which was itself the tell, because real people had paper trails and ghosts did not. Dante found her afterward in a service hallway behind the kitchen, still in the navy dress, adrenaline draining out of her hands in the particular tremor she always got 4 hours too late. "You just did it again," he said. "Somebody has to. You didn't even hesitate." "Hesitating gets people dead. I don't have the luxury." She looked at him properly then, at the stillness in his face that other people mistook for calm, and that she was starting to understand, was closer to a held breath. Something else happened tonight. I saw your man Salt's face change. What was it? He didn't answer for a moment, weighing, she guessed, whether telling her made her more useful or more exposed, the same calculation he seemed to run on everyone, always, without exception. Someone on the inside, he said finally, has been feeding information to people who shouldn't have it. Tonight confirmed who? The sommelier. The sommelier is nobody. He's a conduit. It's who's paying him that matters, and that's a man who's had a seat at my table for 6 years. Something moved behind Dante's eyes, brief and cold, gone as fast as it arrived. Vincent! She'd met Vincent twice, a soft-spoken accountant type who complimented her dress at the gala and asked, kindly, how her son was doing in school, a detail she hadn't remembered telling anyone. That detail sat wrong in her stomach the second Dante said the name, the way a smell sits wrong before the mind catches up to why. What happens to him? She asked, already half certain she wouldn't like the answer, and asking anyway, because not asking felt like its own kind of complicity. Dante's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was, she'd come to understand, the whole architecture of his menace, the fact that it never needed volume. Nothing happens to him tonight, he said. Nothing happens to him tomorrow. He gets to go home and sleep in his own bed and kiss his own kids goodnight. Because a man who knows he's caught and doesn't know when the bill comes due is far more useful to me scared than dead. A beat. Eventually, something happens to him. Not yet. Not loud. Just, eventually. The quiet after that sentence lasted longer than the one after her hands had restarted his heart. That's supposed to be mercy, she asked. It's supposed to be Tuesday, he said, and for the first time she heard something under the flatness of his voice, something almost like fatigue, the particular exhaustion of a man who had made peace with being feared long before he'd made peace with anything else. You don't have to like how I run things. You just told me, in a room with a folded newspaper outside it, that you'd do this your way or not at all. I respected that. Extend me the same courtesy. She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that didn't feel like agreeing to something she hadn't fully priced out yet. She went home that night with the navy dress still smelling of hotel smoke and hors d'oeuvres, and she sat on the edge of Iggy's bed for a long time watching him sleep, and she thought about a soft-spoken man who'd asked kindly about her son, and she did not sleep much herself. 3 nights later, Dante called her up to the penthouse floor above his office, not the 41st, but the 44th, a level Reyes had once told her, half joking, didn't officially exist on the building's registered blueprints. It smelled up there of cedar, even before he opened the door, as if the whole floor had been built around him, instead of the other way around, and underneath it, faint, the smell of rain that hadn't started yet, the specific electric smell the air gets before a storm breaks over a city. You're not here to work, he said, when she stepped off the elevator, which told her immediately that whatever this was, it wasn't on the clock, wasn't in the contract, wasn't a thing she had negotiated terms for. Then why am I here? I wanted a drink, and I didn't want to have it alone. He said it like a confession, which, from a man who spoke every other sentence like a closing argument, was itself a kind of vulnerability she hadn't seen from him before. There was whiskey, the good kind, the kind that cost more per pour than she used to make in a shift. She took the glass because refusing felt like more of a statement than accepting, and she sat, not across from him but near him, on a leather couch that smelled faintly of him even before she'd sat down, cedar and pepper and the ghost of tobacco. You didn't grow up with money, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd watched him eat, watched the specific way he still checked prices on a menu, out of habit, even though the number no longer mattered to him. A tell that survived long after the poverty that created it had been buried under 4 decades of wealth. Red Hook, he said. My father ran numbers out of the back of a barber shop. We had 1 bedroom for 5 people and a landlord who came around personally to remind us of that fact, usually with somebody standing behind him who didn't say anything at all. A pause. I know what your kitchen table looks like when the rent's short. I grew up watching my mother do the same math you do. That why you left the receipt with the job offer? The inhaler? That was information. I don't do anything without information. But something in his face contradicted the flatness of the sentence. Some small admission he hadn't meant to make. You could have just given me the money. Didn't need the theater of the envelope. If I'd handed you cash outright, you'd have thrown it back at me. You've got more pride than sense, which I mean as a compliment, which is rare for me. He looked at his glass instead of at her, which she noticed, because everything about this man was usually a study in looking directly at whatever he wanted people to be afraid of. I don't do this. Sitting, talking. I don't let people see me between the moments where I'm deciding things. Then why me? Because you weren't afraid of me the first night, and you haven't been afraid of me since, and in 30 years, nobody who works for me has managed that particular trick. He reached out, not fast, not grabbing, just a slow motion any nurse would recognize as a request rather than a demand, and rested 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, where a fading bruise sat from bracing a patient's arm 3 nights before. You favor this side. You brace with it. It's why the bruise is always here, and never the other wrist. You've been watching my hands. I watch everyone's hands. Hands tell you everything a face is trained to hide. His thumb moved, once, slow, against the bruise, not quite a caress, and not quite nothing, and she felt the warmth of it travel up through her arm and settle somewhere under her ribs that had nothing to do with adrenaline. Yours have never once shaken when it mattered. They shake after, every time, 4 hours late, like clockwork. So do mine, he said, quiet, the kind of quiet reserved for things men like him did not admit to anyone, and for a moment, the whole floor, the whole building, the whole architecture of fear he'd built around himself for 30 years seemed to hold its breath along with him. She didn't pull her wrist away. She should have. She catalogued, somewhere in the part of her brain that still ran cold math even now, all the reasons this was a bad idea. The contract, the 6 months, the son asleep 4 hours away in an apartment that smelled of someone else's fried garlic, the soft-spoken man named Vincent who was walking around right now, not knowing exactly when his own bill would come due. None of the reasons moved her hand. We come from the same dirt, he said. You know that. That's why this feels the way it feels. What way does it feel? Dangerous, he said. And honest, which in my experience are usually the same thing, wearing different coats. The silence after that lasted a long time. Neither of them moved to close the distance further. It sat there, charged and unfinished, the particular ache of a thing both people want, and neither person is willing yet to be the one who starts it. I should go home, she said finally. Iggy has school. I know, he said, and let go of her wrist, slow, like something being returned rather than released. Go home, Marisol. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed. She was fairly sure he'd chosen the moment on purpose, the way he chose everything on purpose, and she was fairly sure, standing in the elevator 4 minutes later, with her wrist still warm where his fingers had been, that she was in far more danger now than she had been the night his heart had stopped in front of her. Morning arrived with rain that had finally broken overnight, the streets outside Osborne Street slick and dark, the smell of wet asphalt mixing with the fried garlic that lived permanently in her building's stairwell. Marisol made breakfast for Iggy on autopilot, her wrist still carrying the ghost of a touch she hadn't asked for and hadn't refused, and she told herself, scraping eggs onto a plate with the same flat competence she brought to everything, that whatever had happened on the 44th floor was a single, unrepeatable moment, a fluke of adrenaline and whiskey and 2 tired people from the same dirt, recognizing each other in a room built to make people afraid. She almost believed it. She almost got through an entire week believing it, until Reyes called her at 6:15 on a Thursday evening with a voice that had lost its usual careful neutrality. You need to come in, he said. Now. Not the hospital. The office. Iggy's got a... Now, Marisol. The way he said her name told her something had shifted, some tectonic plate under the whole operation grinding loose, and she called her downstairs neighbor, a retired postal worker named Mrs. Aquino, who watched Iggy for $8 an hour and a plate of whatever Marisol had cooked that week, and she was on the 41st floor in 19 minutes flat, her hair still wet from the rain, her heart doing the thing it did before a code, that anticipatory hammering that had nothing yet to hammer against. The office, when she arrived, was wrong in a way she felt before she could name it. Too many people standing. Salt near the window instead of the door, which she'd learned in 6 weeks meant something had already gone bad rather than something that might. Reyes pale, a color she hadn't seen on him even the night of the flatline. Dante stood at the head of the room, and for the first time since she'd met him, his stillness had a different quality to it. Not the coiled patience of a man deciding what to do, but the flat, dangerous calm of a man who had already decided and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. "Vincent's gone," Reyes said. "Not dead. Gone. Cleared out his apartment, pulled his kids from school this morning, wired everything liquid out of 3 accounts we didn't know he had. He knew we were onto him before we made a move." "Which means somebody told him," Dante said, quiet. And the quiet had teeth in it now, the kind of quiet that made Reyes take an involuntary half-step back before he caught himself. "Somebody in this building. Somebody who was in the room 3 nights ago, when I said his name out loud for the first time." The room went very still. Marisol felt every eye that wasn't looking directly at her looking at her anyway, the particular sensation of being suspected without being accused, and she understood, with a cold drop in her stomach that had nothing to do with adrenaline, exactly how short a list of people had been in that room 3 nights ago on the 44th floor. "I was there," she said, before anyone else could say it for her. "I know how this looks." "I know you weren't the leak," Dante said, and something in the way he said it, flat, certain, not even glancing her way for confirmation, told her he'd already run whatever quiet machinery he ran on everyone, and had cleared her before she'd even finished the sentence. "But other people in this room don't know that yet, and other people outside this building are going to want to know why the woman with no history in this world was standing next to me the exact night the leak got confirmed. What does that mean for me?" "It means," Salt said, from the window, not turning around, "that whoever's been feeding Vincent information for 6 years now knows you exist, and knows you are close enough to hear things, and people who feed information for 6 years without getting caught don't stop being careful just because their inside man ran." The room's temperature seemed to drop 3 degrees. Marisol thought, with the specific, exact dollar amount clarity she brought to everything, of Iggy asleep 4 flights up an apartment building with a lock that stuck if you didn't jiggle it a certain way, of Mrs. Aquino's door that she'd never once seen bolted, of every unprotected hour of her son's life that she had never before had a reason to count as a vulnerability. "You're saying my son is a target," she said, flat, no shake in her voice yet. "That would come later, 4 hours late, like clockwork." "I'm saying," Dante said, and for the first time, he crossed the room to stand directly in front of her, close enough that the cedar and pepper of him blotted out everything else in the room, "that I don't let people who work for me become collateral. Not you, not him." A beat, his voice dropping lower, quieter, the register he reserved for things that mattered more than anything else he said all day. "I'm moving security to your building tonight. You're not going home to Osborne Street alone, and neither is your son, not until I know who's been talking." "That's not a request." "No," he said, "it isn't." She should have argued. Some old, stubborn part of her, the part that had told him she'd do this her way or not at all, the part that had walked out of room 411 the first time refusing his cash, wanted to argue on principle alone, wanted to remind him that she had negotiated terms precisely, so she would never again be a woman with no say in what happened to her own life. But she thought of the sticking lock on her own door, and Mrs. Aquino's unbolted one, and Iggy's face reporting facts instead of asking for things, and the arithmetic, cold and exact, told her there was no version of pride worth gambling with that particular number. "Fine," she said, "but I want to know who it is. Not eventually. Now, or as close to now as you can manage." "We're already working it," Reyes said. "Work faster," Dante said, not raising his voice, and the room moved at the words, the way water moves when something heavy drops into it, sudden and total and without argument. By midnight, 3 of Salt's men were stationed on Osborne Street in a car that didn't fit the block, and Marisol sat on the edge of Iggy's bed again, watching him sleep, feeling the particular fear that has nothing to do with your own body and everything to do with someone smaller who trusts you completely to keep the world from touching them. She thought about the 11 seconds it had taken her hands to remember what to do the night Dante's heart stopped, and she thought that this, whatever was coming, whoever had been quietly feeding information out of a building 4 blocks from her son's school for 6 years, was going to need more than 11 seconds and a set of trained hands. Her phone buzzed at 1:14 a.m. A single text, from a number she didn't recognize, sent from somewhere the message made very clear had already been inside information she'd assumed was private. Tell Cusano his medical liaison should stick to mopping floors. Some things don't need a second opinion. She read it twice. She did not shake. Not yet. That would come later, 4 hours late, exactly on schedule. And she picked up her own phone and typed a single line back to Reyes instead of to the number itself, because she had learned, in 6 weeks on this payroll, that the smartest move in a room full of people deciding whether to be afraid of you was to never once let them see you flinch first. Somebody just told me to stick to mopping. Tell your boss I don't take career advice from anonymous numbers, and find them before they find my son's school. Reyes called at 6 a.m., after a night that had passed the way all bad nights pass, in 10-minute increments that felt like hours. He didn't waste time on greetings. "We think we know who it is," he said. "We're not certain. Certain gets people killed on the wrong information, so we're not moving until we are." "Who?" "Someone close enough to know Vincent's schedule and close enough to know about you specifically. That's a short list, and it's a list I don't like the shape of." A pause, the kind that told her he was choosing his next words with unusual care. "Salt wants you to come in this morning. Not to the office. Somewhere else. He says it's safer if you don't ask where, until you're already in the car." She thought of the text, still sitting unanswered on her phone, of the specific chill of a stranger knowing the word mopping was a wound they could reach into her with. And she thought of Iggy, who she'd sent to school that morning flanked, without his knowledge, by a car that didn't belong on the block, and a driver whose jacket sat a half-inch too structured to be anything but a holster underneath it. "I'll come," she said, "but I want eyes on my son's school the entire time I'm gone. Not eventually. The entire time." "Already done," Reyes said, which told her, more than any promise could have, exactly how seriously the ground under this operation had shifted overnight. The car that picked her up an hour later took a route she didn't recognize, past blocks she'd never had reason to walk, and ended at a service entrance behind a building with no sign, the kind of address that existed for people whose business required that addresses not exist. Salt met her at the door, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked, if not afraid, then something adjacent to it, the flat readiness of a man who has done the math on a threat and doesn't love the answer he got. "Boss is inside," Salt said. "Before you go in, he doesn't know I'm telling you this, and if he asks, I didn't. The name we think it is. It's someone who was standing 4 feet from you the night his heart stopped. Someone who's been inside this operation almost as long as I have." Her stomach dropped, cold and fast, the specific vertigo of a fact rearranging every memory it touches the instant it lands. She thought back to Ward 4, to the 12 people frozen in that room, to the nurse who had grabbed her sleeve and read her badge aloud without meaning to every face that had stood close enough to watch her hands work and had said nothing about it since. "Who?" she said. Salt didn't answer. He opened the door instead, and the cedar and pepper smell of Dante Cusano hit her before she'd taken a single step inside, and somewhere past him, in a chair that had been positioned facing the door on purpose, sat a face she recognized immediately, a face that had smiled at her exactly once, kindly, the very first week she'd come to work in that building, and asked her, in a voice that had sounded warm at the time and now sounded like something else entirely, how her son was settling into his new school. The face looked up. It did not look surprised to see her. It looked, if anything, like it had been waiting. "Marisol," it said, in the same warm, familiar voice, "you should have stuck to mopping floors." The room held its silence, the way Ward 4 had held it, the way the gala had held it, that particular vacuum that formed whenever the ground under a story shifted faster than the people standing on it could adjust their footing. Dante hadn't moved from where he stood near the window, And Marisol understood, looking at the flat set of his jaw, that this recognition, whoever this face belonged to, whatever name went with it, had cost him something he hadn't let show on his face in 30 years. "You know her," Marisol said, because saying the obvious thing out loud sometimes was the only way to make a room start moving again. "I trained her," Dante said, quiet, and for the first time since the flatline, his quiet did not sound like menace. It sounded like something closer to grief wearing menace's coat, because grief was not a fabric men like him were permitted to wear in front of other people, not even now. The woman in the chair, mid-50s, silver-threaded hair pulled back the way a nurse's would be, hands folded with the particular stillness Marisol recognized because she'd spent 30 years cultivating that same stillness in herself, smiled again. Small, unhurried, entirely unafraid of the room she was sitting in. "He trained me 20 years before he ever laid eyes on you," the woman said. "I was doing what you do now before you were old enough to hold a heart in your hands. The difference is, I learned a long time ago that loyalty in this business has an expiration date, and mine expired the day he decided a housekeeper with a badge that read Dela Cruz M was worth more to him than 20 years of mine." "That's not," Marisol started. "It's exactly that," the woman said, gently, almost kindly, the way you'd correct a child's homework rather than confront an enemy. "You brought your son up in conversation once, in passing, to be friendly, and I remembered it, because remembering things people say in passing is the entire skill set this job requires. I've been remembering things people say in passing for 20 years. It's how Vincent knew when to run. It's how I've known, since the hour you clocked in for Cusano, exactly which school your son attends and exactly which bus he takes home." The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence in Ward 4 had, longer than the 11 seconds after his heart restarted, long enough that Marisol felt her own pulse in her ears, the way she used to feel it in the 4 hours after a code, when the shaking finally arrived. Dante crossed the room, slow, and for once did not speak in the quiet, careful register that made rooms go still. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only the three of them heard it. "You don't touch her, son," he said. "You don't touch her. Whatever you think you're owed, whatever 20 years bought you, it does not buy you that." "It's a little late for terms, Dante," the woman said, still smiling, still perfectly, unnervingly calm. "I made my calls before Salt's men ever knocked on my door. The only question left in this room is whether you find out where and when, before or after it happens." Marisol felt her own hands go cold, the old training rising in her chest, not as competence now, but as pure animal dread, the specific arithmetic of a mother doing math she had never once, in 8 years, allowed herself to fully imagine. "Where's my son?" she said, and her voice, for the first time since the night his heart had stopped in front of her, finally shook. The woman in the chair did not answer. She only looked, very deliberately, at the phone sitting silent on the table beside her, the screen dark, waiting, the way a held breath waits for permission to let go. "Sit down, Marisol," Dante said, low, steady, reaching for her arm the way he had reached for her wrist on the 44th floor, except this time there was nothing slow or charged about it, only urgency, dressed as calm. "We're going to fix this. I promise you that." "You don't get to promise me that," she said, and pulled her arm free, and the phone on the table between them stayed exactly where it was, dark, silent, holding whatever answer it was holding, and nobody in that room, not Dante, not Salt, not the woman with 20 years of stillness, folded into her hands, moved to pick it up. Marisol looked at it for a long moment. Then, in a voice that had no business sounding as flat and ordinary as it did given everything underneath it, she said the only thing that came to her, the same instinct that had once made her tell a man she'd just brought back from the dead that he was welcome before she'd even had time to be afraid of him. "Somebody's going to have to answer that phone eventually," she said, "and it isn't going to be me standing here doing nothing." She reached for it herself. Marisol de la Cruz came to that hospital ward invisible, a woman the world had trained itself not to see, and Dante Cusano was a man nobody in his world had ever seen frightened, until the night her hands gave him back his heartbeat, and neither of their lives belonged only to them anymore. Whether her son is safe, whether 20 years of quiet loyalty curdled into something 20 years in the making can be undone with one phone call, and whether a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated is about to prove, one final time, exactly how badly the people around her have miscalculated her. That's the question this chapter leaves hanging in the room with them. If you want to find out what's on that phone, and what Marisol does next, let me know in the comments what you think happens. Does Dante get there in time, or does she save herself the way she saved everyone else in this story so far? Like this video if you felt your own pulse pick up in that final scene, share it with someone who needs a story like this in their life, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next chapter. See you there.